I'd like to begin with some general remarks about the terrain, then turn to some recent work on implementation. So from the earliest stage of the generative enterprise, so-called, the primary concern has been explanation of linguistic phenomena. That was a very sharp break from the mid-20th century structuralist consensus that linguistics is what was called a taxonomic science, concerned with identification and classification of elements by a fixed array of procedures. Another sharp break was adoption of what later came to be called the Bio-Linguistics Framework, that is, taking language to be a property of the organism, a computational system coded in the brain that for each individual recursively generates an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions, each basically formulating a thought. We can call that the basic property of language from this perspective. Secondarily, each expression can be, though need not be, externalized in one or another sensory motor medium. For clarity, I'll reserve the term I-language in the usual sense to the internal system that incorporates the basic property. Well, returning to explanation, as in all of science, depth of explanation derives from simplicity of assumptions. For language, two kinds of explanation are needed: for individual languages, for the faculty of language, FL. For the former, explanations are provided by a generative grammar. For FL, explanations are provided by UG, our prime concern in considering genuine explanation. So what we're asking for is simplicity of UG. Well, UG has to satisfy crucial empirical conditions. One is the learnability condition. UG must show how each I language can be attained on the basis of the data available. That's been a guiding concern ever since the origins of the enterprise. It's often called explanatory adequacy. The second condition on UG is evolvability. It's been a concern from the early days, but it was put aside until very recently for good reasons. We can study the evolution of any system only to the extent that we know what it is. And it's only very recently, I think, that we've been gaining the kind of understanding of FL, faculty of language, that makes the effort feasible. Nevertheless, it has always been recognized that UG must meet the twin conditions of learnability and evolvability, and tensions arose at once. The goals of UG appear to be in conflict. UG must be rich enough to overcome the problem of poverty of stimulus. UG must be simple enough to have evolved under the conditions of human evolution, and UG must be the same for all possible languages. Those are the three basic conditions, and it's a conundrum. Condition 3, universality, arises from the conclusion that language is a species property common to humans apart from severe pathology, and at once raises the question how to account for the apparent variety of languages. Well, we achieve a genuine explanation of some linguistic phenomenon only to the extent that it keeps to mechanisms that satisfy the joint conditions of learnability, evolvability, and universality, which appear to be in conflict. And the course of theoretical inquiry for the past 70 years has largely been driven by the goal of reconciling these conflicting requirements. These problems were evident at the outset of the generative enterprise. We now know that they're considerably more severe than had been envisioned until recently. With regard to evolvability, recent work in genetics and paleoanthropology indicates that the window for evolution of language is narrow. Humans began to separate not long after they appeared, all sharing the language faculty. And there's no meaningful evidence for any symbolic activity before humans appeared. So it seems likely then that language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens, which is an instant of evolutionary time. So we would therefore expect that the core structure of language should be quite simple, the result of some relatively small rewiring of the brain, and the apparent contradiction with learnability therefore becomes even sharper. Well, research on language acquisition has extended the dilemma further. It's shown that a child of 2 or 3 has largely mastered basic properties of its language, including some quite remarkable ones. Furthermore, statistical study of the data available to a child, mainly by Charles Yang, shows that relevant evidence is very sparse. These discoveries seem to require that UG be very rich in order to overcome the enormous gap between data available and knowledge attained, while the condition of evolvability demands that UG be very restricted, and the problem of apparently endless variation lurks in the background. Well, in the past few years, some hope has emerged for resolving this tangle of dilemmas within the so-called minimalist program, which has provided the first cases of genuine explanation for some fundamental properties of language. The most striking example is structure dependence. It's the deepest general property of language with very rich consequences. It's also part of the knowledge possessed as early as testing as possible by 30 months or even less. The property is plainly unlearnable. The consequences are far-reaching and very surprising. It means that the infant is ignoring 100% of what it hears, namely linear structures of words, and it's attending only to what it never hears, structures created by its mind. Mental design requires that for language, the child not use elementary computations that are certainly within the range of its cognitive repertoire, like adjacency or finding the first beat on a string, but it can only use computation on abstract structures that its mind constructs. A far-reaching result. The only plausible conclusion is that language has 2 quite distinct components. The I language that generates the linguistic expression of thought, and a system of externalization that maps the generated structures to some SM, sensory motor medium, but doesn't interact with the I language other than spelling it out. The external systems require order, linear order, but this is not, strictly speaking, a property of language. Rather, it's a property of an amalgam of language and systems that are entirely unrelated to language in their evolution and nature, articulation, gesture, vision. In these terms, we can envision a potential resolution of the conundrum facing UG. The third condition on universality can perhaps be put to the side in the study of the core system of generation of thought. The variety of languages might well be localized largely in peripheral aspects of lexicon and in externalization, possibly completely localized there. We may someday learn. I think that's the direction in which work is tending. And notice that would be a very natural outcome. The poverty of stimulus conditions on the core system are severe and sometimes clearly insurmountable, as in the case of structure dependence. Furthermore, the amalgam of the sensory motor system and eye language poses a cognitive problem that can be solved in many ways. And it would not be surprising to find that it's the locus of the complexity, mutability of language, along with the variety which is superficial if these ideas are on the right track. Well, if that's the case, then at least for eye language, the conundrum largely reduces to satisfying the evolvability condition. That problem will be overcome to the extent that the structures of language are generated by the simplest operations. The so-called strong minimalist theory, SMT, sets this outcome as a prime goal of the theory of language. Well, returning to structure dependence, problem of learnability is overcome if the property is part of UG, as clearly seems to be the case. There is then no learning. The problem of evolvability is overcome if the property follows from the simplest computational operation, one that must exist if language is to exist at all. And in fact, that's the case. The simplest combinatorial operation is binary set formation, it's merge in contemporary terminology, though actually the matter is more complex, as I'll return to. Structure dependence follows at once. Linear order is not an option if merge for the child, if merge is the combinatorial operation for language, part of the child's innate endowment. I think it's fair to say that this is the first genuine explanation of a significant property of language, and a highly significant one in this case. I might mention that structure dependence makes certain thoughts inexpressible without complex circumlocution. So take, say, the boy or the girl is here. Fine. The boys and the girls are here. Fine. But try to mix them. The boys are John or John. Can't be is, can't be are. You just can't say it. It's a very simple thought, but restriction to structures makes it inexpressible. You have to make some circumlocution, or take the sentence, can eagles that fly can swim? It's a perfectly good thought. It's asking, is it the case that eagles that can swim can also fly? But it's inexpressible. Would be very simple if linear order were possible, but it's not. Well, actually, this illustrates a very general phenomenon. Whenever there's a conflict between computational and communicative efficiency, and there are many, communicative efficiency is always sacrificed, 100%. So to put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature was constructing language, she was concerned with optimal design, didn't care about use for communication or anything else. Actually, that's the way evolution very generally works. Well, genuine explanation extends further. The condition is satisfied when an account relies on so-called third factor principles, such as computational efficiency, understood in this context as natural law. These can just be taken off the shelf when needed with no cost. And the strong minimalist thesis sets as an ideal that all linguistic phenomena can receive genuine explanations in this broader sense. And the critical task for inquiry is to see how closely this ideal can be approximated. Well, in these terms, there are genuine merge-based explanations for other fundamental properties of language beyond structure dependence. One is the ubiquity of displacement with reconstruction, which was always regarded by me in particular as a curious imperfection of language, serious, problematic departure from good design. In fact, displacement with reconstruction follows from the simplest subcase of merge, internal merge, the case that involves least search by a huge margin and in isolation yields a basis for knowledge of arithmetic. So the apparent problem has been misconceived. The real question is why language ever resorts to the far richer subcase external merge. That's clearly a reflection of the fact that language assigns argument structure to generated expressions. These happen to require externally merged generated structure. More generally, language observes theta theory. It's a bare output condition in the usual terminology. Well, these observations bring to the fore some general considerations about the strong minimalist thesis. It does serve a disciplinary function. It restricts the mechanisms that are available for description of language. That's a necessity if we're to approach the goal of genuine explanation. The less recognized is the fact that strong minimalist thesis also serves an enabling function. It provides options and systems for language that would have no reason to exist if language did not abide by the strong minimalist thesis. That turns out to have interesting consequences, to which I'll turn. Well, as we've often found before, the standard definition of merge had hidden assumptions and permitted unacceptable rules, and it must be purged of these errors if we hope to achieve genuine explanation. One flaw easily remedied is the failure to recognize that merge is actually an operation on the workspace. It both adds and removes elements. So merge must be defined as in this. We'll see if this works. Let me see. Camera. Well, as I feared, the technology is not working. So I'm going to have to ask you to use your imaginations if you don't mind. Here's the actual definition of merge. See if you can think of it. So merge will operate on three things. Take P, we have a workspace, call it WS, and merge is an operation on P, Q, WS, creates a new workspace, call it WS prime. Here's where your imaginations come in. WS prime is a set which has the following members. One is the set PQ, the one that's formed by the operation. The second, call it W. The third is the sequence of elements, call them X1 to Xn, where conditions have to be met. Well, what's W? W is whatever is unaffected by the operation, hence carried over. The Xi's are whatever is added to merge, and Z is the condition that the operations must meet, all of which should factor follow from third factor considerations if the strong minimalist thesis is to be satisfied. And the choice of N should as well. That, in fact, is the case. The most important condition is that n must be as small as possible. That's a consequence of minimization of search. At least one item must be added to WS, the workspace, but no more. Call this property resource restriction, RR. It follows directly from the requirement that the search space for operations should be minimal, third factor condition of optimal computation, which comes free. Well, RR has important empirical consequences. Suppose it were violated. Suppose that the only members of the workspace are P and Q. We're now ignoring RR. So merge will yield the following, and again, I'm going to have to use your imaginations. Merge will yield a four-member workspace. One of them will be the set PQ, which is formed. The others will be P and Q, the two elements from which it was formed. Okay, that's what happens if you don't have from the original definition of merge, but that's impossible. First, it permits lethal indeterminacy. So if the next operation merges P with some new element, call it X, there are two possibilities with outcomes that differ at the two interfaces depending on which P you pick. Now that's an intolerable situation. And much more seriously than that, this definition permits legitimate derivations with ungrammatical outcomes. So take a look at the set PQ. It can be expanded arbitrarily to some very complex thing, call it R, arbitrary complexity, innumerable islands. But the P that was left behind can now merge with R, forming something new. And the outcome is indistinguishable from the P that was internal to PQ merging with this. Hopelessly ungrammatical. It's as if, say, the object of an unaccusative could raise over arbitrarily many islands. Well, plainly impossible. So therefore, you can't use the simple definition of merge. For many reasons, it's wrong. And RR, restrict resources, must be a condition on merge. Fortunately, it's a consequence of the strong minimalist thesis, so we're in business. Notice that this has further consequences. It means that derivations are strictly Markovian in a very strong sense. The derived workspace, which is the current state of the derivation, does not contain items that were generated earlier. This is quite unlike normal recursion, as in, say, proof theory or applying the rules of formation for formal systems. Here, the history of derivation is contained in the current state. So in running through say, a proof, if you've proven a P horseshoe Q, you can go back and add P and prove something using P. Same with the rules of formation. Can't do that in language. Strictly Markovian. Generation cannot lead back to earlier steps. That's very striking. This strict Markovian character of linguistic derivation has very important consequences. So we'll see directly. Well, actually, this resource restriction of linguistic recursion is quite natural for an organic system. It may have deeper roots in properties of the brain. That's a matter that's been discussed by Sandui Fang. These same restrictive properties of the strong minimalist thesis impose other conditions on linguistic operations. The one I've mentioned, binarity, follows at once. So does strict cyclicity, which reduces search, hence the phase impenetrability condition. PIC follows directly. A minimal search is another corollary, restrict search space. For each of these consequences, there is direct empirical evidence, as in the case of RR. So we have the following situation. Assuming the strong minimalist thesis, we deduce resource restriction that yields a variety of consequences, empirical consequences like structure dependence and displacement, reconstruction, but also principled consequences like minimal search, PIC, the impenetrability condition, and binarity. They all follow. So merge is basically just the simplest operation. We don't have to say anything about merge. It's the operation which adds nothing, maximally satisfies simple search. Notice that merge must also satisfy theta theory. That's the bare out condition that I already mentioned. To take one example, theta theory holds that theta assignment is univocal. So a single theta assigner cannot assign two theta roles to the same element. If it could, then a sentence like John likes John with two different Johns could be pronounced John likes. Okay, why? The object would raise to subject position, then it would delete, as in normal raising, and the verb like would be assigning two theta roles to John. Well, can't have that. So theta theory blocks that for merge. Notice that theta theory applies only to merge, doesn't apply to other operations which aren't involved in composition. It's quite crucial. Has very interesting ramifications. So let's take the following sentence form. John tried infinitive X to win. X could be either Bill or Mary or John or whatever. So John tried X to win. Suppose X is John. In this case, John tried John to win. Well, in this case, X can delete. So that's different from John likes John. And the difference is there's no theta theory violation. There are two different theta assigners, try and win, so theta theory satisfied. That does leave a problem. Why can X be taken to be a copy of John? In other words, why can the lower John be a copy of the higher one and then delete in the normal way? Well, the answer follows from the nature of derivation. For expository convenience, I'll assume that there's an operation interpretation, call it int, which takes a look at the current stage of derivation, that is the workspace, and it decides what can be done next. That's int. Viewing the workspace, int can detect the kind of structure that is created by internal merge. Let's call that an internal merge configuration. But int lacks access to history. It's all strict Markovian. It doesn't know how that IAM configuration was constructed. So there has to be an operation, let's call it copy formation, that assigns the copy relation to the actual cases of internal merge. Okay, must verify that internal merge took place when it did, but it will also assign the copy configuration, the copy relation, to IAM configurations that were constructed in some other way. It's blind to history. Copy formation can't know. So therefore, copy formation yields two kinds of IAM configurations. One is just verifying the IAM operation. One is configuration formed in some other way. The latter type, let's call IAM gaps. Well, copy formation adheres to the general properties of all operations, minimal search. So it'll have the same combinatorial properties of merge, but for form copy, bare output conditions are irrelevant. It's an important principal distinction. And notice we're not assuming anything. All of this simply follows from the strong minimalist thesis. Well, let's go back to John tried X to win. Int determines that it is an IM configuration. So with a different matrix verb, say seems, it would be fine. For theta theoretic reasons, it cannot be a case of internal merge because of the univocality of theta theory. But X can be taken to be a copy, an IM gap, and it can therefore delete. This is the phenomenon of obligatory control. So we therefore capture an important insight of Norbert Hornstein's about the similarity of raising and control. But I stress similarity, it's not identity, because there are two kinds of IM configurations, one derived from merge, the other from forming copy. These are trace and pro in traditional terms. We don't have to distinguish them. I'll use the terms for convenience. All of this just derives from the strong minimalist thesis. Well, int can't distinguish them, but other operations can, and they do. They differ in many ways. And again, I can't display them, so I'll just ask you to listen. So take Luigi Burzio's old examples. One interpreter each seems to have been assigned to the diplomats. Trace, it's okay. One interpreter each tried to be assigned to the diplomats. Pro, not okay. Lots of examples with clitic raising. It's too complicated without presenting them, so I won't present it. But it turns out that trace and pro differ greatly in the kinds of clitic placement that takes place. Well, there's also experimental evidence distinguishing trace and pro, Tom Bever's work. The distinction is solidly established. That sustains theta theory and the so-called duality of semantics. External merge is linked to theta theory, argument structure. Internal merge is linked to other properties of utterances, discourse related, information related, and so on. Well, so far I've been considering raising to subject. Let's turn to raising to object. Ought to turn out the same way. So take the two sentences. John expected Bill to leave. John persuaded Bill to leave. Okay. These should be analogous to the subject raising and control cases that I just discussed. And in fact, they are. So think of the way they work. In the first, John expected Bill to leave. Bill raises by internal merge to the specifier of expect. It's just like subject raising. In the second case, John persuaded Bill to leave. Bill is merged by external merged with the complex object persuade Bill to leave. It's the direct object of that complex object. Within our highly restricted framework, the two structures must look exactly identical. They look like this. And again, I'll have to ask you to imagine John followed by inflection, followed by the set, which consists of Bill and V, Bill to leave. V is either expect or persuade. That's the way both should look. And in both cases, minimal search determines that the two occurrences of Bill are copies. In Bill, followed by verb, Bill to leave. Their minimal search identifies them just as in subject raising. If V is expect, the paired copies were generated by internal merge. If V is persuade, Bill was generated by external merge with its own theta role. It's an IM gap, pro structure. In both cases, minimal search deletes the lower copy of Bill. That's object control. So it falls into place under subject control, along with subject control, now relying on the distinction between the reincarnation of trace and pro, but now within the strong minimalist thesis. And notice that this is an illustration of the enabling function of strong minimalist thesis. If you didn't have the strong minimalist thesis, there would be no reason for the linguistic module of obligatory control to exist at all. So given the strong minimalist thesis, it follows that there ought to be obligatory control working in exactly this way, which is the right way. And notice that the analysis of persuade resurrects an approach to double complement constructions that goes way back to the 50s, the logical structure of linguistic theory, but now in a far more restricted framework. In the LSLT analysis, a transformation formed the complex object persuade to leave with the object bill. In the analysis here, the infinitive persuade to leave is just the complement of persuade, of John to leave is the complement of Bill to leave. That's the complement of persuade. And Bill is the one you see is the object of the verbal complex persuade Bill to leave. I think it's quite possible that all double complement constructions fall into this framework, topic worth looking about. Well, it seems then that the entire obligatory control module is made available by the strong minimalist thesis, requires no extra assumptions. We can capture Hornstein's crucial insight about control while avoiding the empirical problems that bar general recourse to internal merge. We also maintain, in effect, the pro-trace distinction with its strong empirical support. And we also maintain theta theory unchanged and duality of semantics unchanged. Well, let's turn to some other cases. One case is a long-standing problem about simply raising the subject. So take normal raising the surface subject. The basic structure I'll ask you to imagine again. At the phase level, we have C, the complementizer, and it's followed by a phrase which consists of the raised external argument, call that EA1, and that's followed by a structure in full, followed by the internal argument EA2 and VP, familiar structure. Copy formation applies at the phase level and is strictly Markovian, so it applies at the level C. So how can it determine that the subject, the surface subject, was raised at an earlier stage of the derivation before C was merged? Raising to subject and its VP counterpart, raising to object, has same problem. These are the only cases where memory seems to be needed beyond what's available at the phase level for int to see that internal merge applies. Those of you familiar with the literature know that this has led to quite a few complications in earlier work. Well, we can now throw them all out. We have a very simple answer. Minimal search assigns the copy relation to the two external occurrences, the external argument. The lower one then automatically deletes. There's no need to determine how the higher one was formed. Int doesn't care, the output doesn't care. There is a problem. The two external arguments are unrelated at the phase level where int applies, and the top one, external argument 1, lacks a theta role. However, independently of how it was formed, it's a copy of the lower one, which is in a theta position. So the top one is what we can call theta linked. A copy, identically interpreted, is in a theta position. Take theta linking to be reflexive. the lower one is also in a theta linked. Theta linking will give us the basic notion for theta theory. I won't bother running through it. Furthermore, the external argument does have a semantic role. In fact, it's the most venerable semantic role of all, the role of argument of predication. We see consequences of that in, for example, the existential presupposition of subject position. It's lacking in so-called existential construction. So you get, there's a fly in the bottle, there's a flaw in the proof. A fly is in the bottle, but not a flaw is in the proof. There's an existential presupposition for subject position, which doesn't actually hold in the existential constructions. And we see it in other cases, like to seem to be intelligent is harder than you'd think. A separate interpretation for the raised argument. So we do have argument structure and theta linking for the raised element. Next task is to raise this, to extend this to raising to object. Here, the raised object also has a semantic role, namely de re interpretation. I'm going to skip examples because of lack of time, but you can run through them. Well, so far, we've kept entirely to the strong minimalist thesis. Let's try to extend the domain of explanation, asking how closely we can approach SMT. And the most interesting case is two very hard problems, which have resisted analysis for 70 years. One of them's head movement. The other is unbounded, unstructured sequences, like John, Bill, Mary, Tom, et cetera, left. No structure, unbounded. Well, let's take head movement. It's a familiar operation, but it's totally illegitimate. Head movement is not formulable within any framework addressing the conditions for genuine explanation. It wasn't formulable in phrase structure grammar, it's not formula in transformational grammar, not in merge theory, no other system. This is discussed elsewhere, but I'll just assume you understand it. For one, it violates the extension condition. For another, it gives the wrong answer. When you raise, say in Pollock's examples, you raise V to T. It's a T with V adjoined to it, but it's got to be the other way around, a V with a T adjoined to it. So you can't do it because it violates the extension condition and it gives the wrong answer. It's a totally illegitimate operation. One problem, a serious one. These differences from normal internal merge have led to the suggestion that the operation is basically phonological, falls within externalization. But that proposal runs foul of the fact that it appears to be cyclic. So you can go from the lower verb to tense to up to C, seems to be one after the other, which can't be phonological. Well, that's the problem. It's been unsolved. Unrestricted rewriting systems are deeply problematic as well. They can't be generated by the richest rewriting systems, even unrestricted ones. It takes infinitely many rules, and they can't be constructed by transformational grammars or any other device that's been thought of. So let's ask then, what are the minimal assumptions needed to incorporate the problems within the domain of explanatory theory? Is that me? I don't know what's happening.
Sorry, there was noise, but
well,
everybody needs.
So we'll keep to the same general framework. I'll only be able to give a very general outline, and I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to rely on even more imagination. I'll omit many details. So let's begin with sequences. We can assume fairly generally that wherever there is any XP, any syntactic object, it's the limiting case of a sequence. So we have John ran, which is the limiting case of the sequence. John, Bill, my friends, an actor who won the Oscar, et cetera, ran, danced, took a vacation, et cetera. The order is crucial, as we can see by adding respectively or other linguistic devices like in that order. For simplicity, let's just keep the conjunction. We therefore need an operation, call it form sequence, that form structures a sequence that looks like this, contains and then x1 to xn. It's a sequence of n+1 elements, and a sequence x1 to xn. The coordinator distributes through the sequence in one or another way, partly depends on the language. There are matching conditions among the xi's, some involving semantic properties. A lot of them are reminiscent of the classical rhetorical device called zeugma. So take the sentence, John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and in a coma. Okay. John arrived at the hospital in an ambulance and a coma. And that one's no good. No Democrat had won Arizona and Georgia since Clinton in 1992 and in an upset, respectively. That's okay. No Democrat had won Arizona and Georgia since Clinton in 92 in an upset, respectively. No good. There's a difference in interpretation between the PP and NP cases. PP coordination can be interpreted as two independent events. NP coordination is a single compound event. It's subject to much more strict matching. Now, the distinction becomes clearer in cases like this. So just take the general sentence. John arrived early, met Bill, got a good seat. That's okay. Now let's try to arrive early, meet Bill, and get a good seat seem to be what John wants. Okay. To arrive early, meet Bill, and get a good seat seems to be what John wants. That one's no good. To arrive early, to meet Bill, and to get a good seat either seems or seem to be what John wants. First case, 3 independent events. The second case, it's a single compound event. Third case, you can interpret in either way. So how do we get all these things? Well, as we'll see directly, 2 steps are required. The first step is just the general operation of set formation, which is free. Talked about it earlier, the core operation I already mentioned. Second step is to merge and to form a sequence. The 2 operations will yield, well, the first one, forming set, will yield something like John lived on a farm with his family. We have the set on a farm with his family, could be many, endlessly extended. The second step will lead to John lived on a farm and with his family. Those are the 2 cases. They differ. Extraction is possible from the first case, from the set. So you can say, which farm did John live on with his family? It's not possible from the second step case. Which farm did John live on and with his family? There are matching conditions for both the set and the sequence, but they're much more stringent for the sequence. In fact, the coordinate structure constraint is just a violation of the more stringent condition, matching condition on sequences. We don't need to say anything more about it. Well, with just this much background, just take one of the more complex sequences, say pairing a non-accusative and a transitive. I'll just keep to the essentials. So take John arrived and met Bill. Okay. The first step is to form 2 independent objects. John arrived, John met Bill, the usual way, satisfies theta theory. The next step is to construct the set of the two of them, the set of containing, let's call it V, small v, arrive John, John, small v, meet Bill. That's the first one. That's just that set. Here I'm adopting, for good reasons, the Barrera-Marantz root categorizer analysis, so that arrive and meet are roots interpreted as verbal if they have the categorizer V. The V star distinction and the phasal distinction is determined by the lexical content of the root, so you don't have to distinguish them. I'll distinguish them only for convenience. Well, then we add merge, we introduce and the inflectional element that yields something that will be the inflectional element followed by a set. The set includes and then followed by the two sets we've already constructed, arrive John and John met Bill. So far we have only sets, so extraction is possible. That means either the occurrences of John, the one on arrive John or the one in John met Bill, either of them can be raised to spec of inflection. It'll yield John followed by this whole object that I just mentioned. We can then add C, get to the phase level, and apply the notion of forming sequence. That'll give us C followed by John, inflection, then the sequence, and the two objects, arrive John and John met Bill. Well, as we've seen, either of the two Johns, the one from the unaccusative or the transitive, either can raise to, by internal merge, the position of the surface subject John. The one that does not raise is determined by minimal search to be a copy of the top one in the surface position. Int can't determine which one raised, but it doesn't matter. The interfaces are not affected. Whichever one it picks, no lethal ambiguity. So whichever choice is taken, what reaches the interfaces, the two interfaces, is exactly the same. Well, as in the case of control theory, interpretation of sequences relies crucially on the I-am gap. This again illustrates the enabling function of the strong minimalist thesis. If language were not constrained by resource restriction, meaning the strong minimalist thesis, these constructions would have no reason to exist, just as obligatory control would have no reason to exist. Well, in the example that I used, the two conjuncts share tense, but that's not necessary. So you'd get the same analysis for John arrives every day at noon and met Bill yesterday. Something follows that tense is a feature of small v. It's not a feature of the inflectional element. That's why I've been calling it infl, not tense. Tense is not part of that unit. It's part of small v, contrary to what's long been assumed. 5 features are fixed for the conjuncts. That's infl. So infl is the set of 5 features. Tense is part of small v. Plus, if we were extended, the various expansions of modality theory and so on, which I'm putting aside, aspect and so on. Well, there's no time to go into it. We'll have to take it on faith, but across the board movement and parasitic gaps fall out as special cases of all of this. Turn to head movement. So far, I haven't made any resort to it. In fact, we now have a way to eliminate that unformable operation. For the interpretation by int, what's forming the thought, the CI interface, structures such as the kind I already mentioned are sufficient. The structure with C, John, infl, and then the two units, V arrive John and John, V star met Bill. That's enough for interpretation. you don't need head movement. So for formulation of thought, head movement isn't even needed. So head movement seems unnecessary for I language. It's not part of the core system. Well, externalization does require an operation that brings together the inflectional elements. That's infl, small v, other categorizers, and roots. Has to bring them together cyclically. So let's say we have an operation, call it amalgamate, which just brings all these small guys together. And since it's doing it cyclically, it'll form structures like inflection followed by the element V root. Okay, that's amalgamating. The further effects with some variation, characteristic of externalization, but we don't need head movement. Well, it seems then that both of the initial problems dissolve. Head movement is eliminated from I language, and at most minimal departure from SMT forming sequences suffices for the very many problems of unstructured, unbounded systems, both coordination and lists. Well, more generally, I should mention I've avoided so far the operation, which is called T to C, or in these terms, infl to C. I don't think it belongs here. It's a different kind of operation. It's part of the V-second phenomenon. It doesn't even require that a head raise. So you can say things like, what would have been the main reactions to these revelations if so-and-so, and put a long phrase in there. It's just a different operation. Doesn't belong in this system. Interesting operation, but different. Well, more generally, just to summarize, it seems that genuine explanations can be provided for quite a wide range of core properties of I language, keeping the operations so simple that they can be assumed to be freely available under the strong minimalist thesis. And it reduces a wide range of phenomena just to the property of minimizing search procedures, principle we can regard as part of natural law for an organic creature. That carries us forward in the course of determining how closely I language approaches SMT. It's a very significant discovery to the extent that the conjecture proves valid. And it also seems that we can see some light in resolving the fundamental dilemma that arose 70 years ago in undertaking the Bio-Linguistic program, the conundrum I mentioned earlier. UG must be rich enough to overcome the POS problem, must be simple enough to have evolved under conditions of human evolution, must be the same for all possible languages. These merge-based systems relying on third factor properties show considerable promise in approaching the goal of reconciling learnability and evolvability. And there seems to be hope in approaching the universality problem with UG restricted to language proper, that's I language, other conditions applying to its interaction with non-linguistic systems that are employed for externalization. Might be possible to aim for higher than this, pursuing the enabling function of the strong minimalist thesis, regarding it not just as a constraint on what can appear in language, which it is, but as a facilitator of the richness of human language. It immediately yields the option for certain kinds of modules of language, which there'd be no reason to exist otherwise. So these like control theory, sequence interpretation, obligatory control, and so on. This is a different perspective, and it poses new questions. Which parts of language are just there because language satisfies the strong minimalist thesis? Otherwise wouldn't be there. Interesting question. Well, the projects, I'll end by just pointing out the projects that lie on the horizon are extremely ambitious. Not so long ago, they would have been regarded as hopelessly premature, if even worth considering at all. I think much less so now. Might very well be that the ancient study of language is moving to quite a new era with new questions and exciting prospects. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Noam. It's such a wonderful thing to hear your ideas always, always. Thank you very much.